Imagine a hermetically sealed glass pyramid rising out of the Arizona desert like a mirage. It looks like a colony designed for the surface of Mars, but it was built right here on Earth in the early 90s. For 30 years, the story of Biosphere 2 has been dismissed as a spectacular failure, a reality TV show before reality TV existed, where 8 people locked themselves in a giant terrarium and slowly went crazy while suffocating. But that is just the surface of a much darker and infinitely more fascinating iceberg. The true story involves an avant-garde theater troupe, a Texas oil billionaire trying to escape the apocalypse, a hostile corporate takeover led by Steve Bannon, and a biological war waged by a single species of ant. Most people think this was just a rich man's hobby, but recent files and renewed interest in 2026 have revealed that this was the most ambitious and dangerous biological experiment ever attempted. We thought we were building a backup drive for Earth, a safe haven for humanity if our planet collapsed. Instead, we accidentally built a trap that proved exactly how little we understand about survival. From the concrete walls that secretly ate the oxygen to the starving crew watching tourists eat hot dogs through the glass, this is the untold story of the Glass Ark. And with recent events in 2025 bringing it back online, we are finally ready to understand what really happened inside.
To understand why this happened, you have to look back to a counterculture commune in New Mexico called Synergia Ranch. This wasn't your typical group of buttoned-up scientists wearing lab coats and holding clipboards. They were a performance group called the Theater of All Possibilities, led by a charismatic metallurgist and poet named John Allen. They believed that Western civilization was collapsing, and they used intense theater exercises to break down their egos. Some critics later described these as psychological struggle sessions designed to create a unit that could survive anything. Enter Ed Bass, a billionaire heir to a Texas oil fortune who was looking for something more meaningful than just wealth. He fell in love with their vision of building an ark for humanity, a structure that could preserve life on Mars or on Earth after a nuclear winter. With his checkbook and their radical philosophy, they bought a massive plot of land near Oracle, Arizona. The goal was not just to build a greenhouse, but to create a completely independent world that was severed from the Earth's atmosphere. They called it Biosphere 2 because Earth is Biosphere 1, and they wanted to prove they could clone our planet. It sounds like the plot of a science fiction novel, but they actually poured $200 million into it. This wasn't just about growing plants or studying photosynthesis. It was a survivalist project born from Cold War anxiety. They built a ship called the Heraclitus and sailed the world collecting corals and plants to stuff into their glass box. But because the team was largely made of generalists and dreamers rather than specialized academic ecologists, the scientific community viewed them with deep suspicion. They were seen as ecological pirates building a doomsday bunker, and in many ways, that assessment wasn't entirely wrong. Despite the skepticism, the engineering was genuinely miraculous, creating a structure that remains a marvel to this day. The facility covers over 3 acres of sealed ground, containing a rainforest, an ocean with a wave machine, a savanna, a mangrove wetland, and a coastal fog desert. It was tighter than the International Space Station, with a leak rate of less than 10% per year. To put that in perspective for you, most commercial buildings leak that much air every single hour. But sealing a building that tightly created a massive physics problem that most people would never even think about. During the day, the Arizona sun heats the air inside, causing it to expand with tremendous force. At night, the desert air cools down rapidly, causing the internal volume to shrink and contract. In a normal building, air just leaks out through the cracks, but in a sealed glass box, that pressure would blow out the windows. So they built what they called the lungs, 2 massive geodesic domes connected to the main structure by tunnels. Inside these domes were 4-ton steel plates attached to heavy rubber membranes that could move up and down. As the air expanded, the lungs would inflate and lift the weights. As it contracted, the weights would push the air back in. It was a brilliant solution that allowed the building to breathe without ever exchanging a single molecule with the outside world. They packed this structure with over 3,000 species, treating it like a biological Noah's Ark. But there was a fatal flaw in their thinking that no amount of engineering could possibly fix. They assumed that if they threw enough species together, nature would naturally find a balance and organize itself. They treated ecology like a self-correcting machine, but they were about to learn that nature is actually a chaotic war. When the airlock hissed shut in September 1991, sealing 8 humans inside for 2 years, the clock started ticking on a biological time bomb.
Almost immediately, the crew noticed something was wrong with the very air they were breathing. Oxygen levels began to drop steadily, day after terrifying day, and nobody could figure out where it was going. The calculations said there should be plenty of plants to recycle the carbon dioxide the crew was exhaling, but the numbers weren't adding up, and the atmosphere was becoming thinner and thinner. By January 1993, the oxygen had dropped to 14%, which is roughly the equivalent of living at 13,000 feet. The crew was dragging themselves around the facility, suffering from sleep apnea and extreme fatigue. They couldn't finish sentences without gasping for breath, and even simple tasks became exhausting ordeals. For years, people thought the plants just failed, but the real culprit was hiding in the walls themselves. It turns out the exposed concrete inside the facility was undergoing a chemical reaction called carbonation. The calcium hydroxide in the concrete was reacting with CO2 to form calcium carbonate and water. Essentially, the building itself was acting like a giant sponge, sucking the carbon dioxide out of the air before the plants could turn it back into breathable oxygen. This is ironically the same chemistry used today by modern carbon capture startups to fight climate change, but back in the 90s, it was a death sentence. The crew was literally being suffocated by their own shelter. At the same time, they were slowly starving to death. Because of unusually cloudy weather and pest infestations, their farm was producing only a fraction of the calories they needed. They lost an average of 18% of their body weight, becoming gaunt skeletons in futuristic jumpsuits. There is a haunting story from that time of the crew pressing their faces against the glass, watching tourists eating ample amounts of food just feet away. The psychological torture of starving inside a glass cage while the rest of the world feasted was unbearable. Finally, the medical team had to intervene, pumping liquid oxygen into the facility to save their lives. It broke the purity of the experiment, but it proved that we cannot yet engineer a life support system that is anywhere near as efficient as the Earth. While the humans were suffocating and starving, the ecosystem around them was collapsing into chaos. The scientists had packed the biosphere with thousands of species, hoping they would form a complex food web. But they made a critical mistake by letting in a stowaway that would eventually conquer the entire facility. A single species of ant, known scientifically as Paratrachina longicornis, or colloquially as the crazy ant, had slipped inside. In the wild, different ant colonies fight each other for territory, keeping their populations in check. But crazy ants form super colonies that don't fight. They just expand relentlessly until they consume everything. Within a few years, the crazy ants had wiped out virtually every other insect species in the biosphere. The crickets were gone, the spiders were decimated, and the pollinators needed for the crops were under siege. It was a total ecological takeover, a monoculture that destroyed the diversity they tried to build. The bees, which were essential for pollinating the squash and fruits, died out completely, disoriented by the glass walls.
The crew had to resort to hand-pollinating their crops, using Q-tips to do the work of the dead insects. Meanwhile, the adorable bush babies they brought in for companionship all died off, unable to survive in the shrinking ecosystem. The hummingbirds perished, and the morning glory vines exploded out of control, choking the rainforest canopy. It was like watching a fast-forward version of an ecological collapse, proving that you can't just throw nature in a box and expect it to work. The complex web of life they envisioned turned into a simple, brutal hierarchy, dominated by ants and vines. This specific failure highlighted a terrifying truth. Once an ecosystem starts to unravel, it cascades faster than you can fix it. We think we can manage nature, but in reality, we are just passengers on a runaway train.
The stress of suffocation, starvation, and failure did exactly what you might expect to the human mind. Psychologists studying isolated environments like Antarctica call it the third quarter phenomenon. It's that point past the halfway mark of a mission where morale hits rock bottom and social cohesion shatters. The crew of 8 split into 2 hostile tribes who barely spoke to each other for the final months. One group, nicknamed the Gero Vitals, remained loyal to management, while the other group, the Sagans, wanted to break the rules. They would walk past each other in the narrow corridors, eyes fixed on the floor, communicating only when absolutely necessary. It was a Cold War fought in a tropical greenhouse, proving that the human element is the hardest part of any system. But the real drama happened after the first mission ended and the second mission began in 1994. By this time, the project was bleeding money, and Ed Bass had hired a new financial manager to clean house. That manager was none other than Steve Bannon, the man who would later become a controversial political strategist. Bannon saw the project as a financial disaster and moved to fire the original leadership team from Synergia Ranch. What happened next was like a scene from an action movie. Federal marshals raided the facility to enforce the takeover, seizing control of the communications and the data. Fearing for the safety of the new crew inside under Bannon's rule, 2 members of the original crew decided to take drastic action. In the middle of the night on April 5, 1994, Abigail Alling and Mark Van Fillo broke back onto the property. They ran through the desert darkness to the airlocks and smashed the glass seals, depressurizing the building. They claimed they were ethically obligated to give the new crew a choice, a way to escape what they viewed as a dangerous dictatorship. It was the chaotic, violent end to the original dream, shattering the illusion of a peaceful scientific endeavor.
For years after the Sabotage and the Bannon takeover, Biosphere 2 was viewed as a laughingstock. It was the butt of jokes, the subject of a Pauly Shore comedy movie, and a cautionary tale about hubris. But once the dust settled and the University of Arizona took over, scientists realized they were sitting on a gold mine. The failure to sustain human life was actually a massive success for understanding how the Earth works. Because the ocean inside was so small, it reacted to carbon dioxide changes much faster than the real ocean. Researchers at Columbia University used the facility to demonstrate the terrifying reality of ocean acidification. They proved that high CO2 levels destroy coral reefs years before we saw the devastating bleaching events in the real world. The facility became a time machine, allowing us to see the future of climate change before it happens. Today, the rainforest is used to study drought resistance, testing how trees survive when the water is turned off. They transformed the agricultural area into the LEO project, the Landscape Evolution Observatory. It consists of 3 massive hill slopes filled with crushed volcanic rock, embedded with thousands of sensors to track every drop of water. It is the largest earth science experiment in the world, helping us understand how landscapes breathe and evolve.
And the story didn't end in the 90s. In fact, we are currently witnessing a massive revival. In October 2025, a researcher named Matthias Beach sealed himself inside the SAM habitat at Biosphere 2. It was the first time in 30 years that a human was part of a sealed biological loop at the facility. He lived with 144 dwarf pea plants, proving that we can use plants to scrub CO2 in high-pressure environments. Then, in early 2026, the internet superstar Mr. Beast filmed a massive production there, bringing it back to global attention. The facility is no longer a failed bunker. It is now the world's most advanced collider for Earth sciences.
One of the most exciting developments happening right now is the transformation of the biosphere's ocean. For decades, the million-gallon tank was largely a dead zone, an algae-filled reminder of the initial collapse. But recently, scientists have launched the Coral Arks project, turning this controlled ocean into a genetic lifeboat. They are introducing genetically diverse supercorals that have been bred to withstand higher temperatures. Because the biosphere acts like a giant greenhouse, the water gets hotter than almost any natural ocean. This makes it the perfect torture chamber to test which corals can survive the coming climate crisis. If a species can survive in the Biosphere 2 ocean, it has a fighting chance of surviving in the real world in 2050. This research is critical because coral reefs support a quarter of all marine life on our planet. If we lose the reefs, we lose the fisheries that feed billions, and the economic fallout would be catastrophic. The biosphere allows us to run these dangerous experiments without risking the health of the actual ocean. It has evolved from a survival shelter for 8 people into a survival laboratory for the entire planet. We are finally using the tool for its true purpose, not to escape Earth, but to learn how to save it. Every failure from the 90s, the suffocating concrete, the dying bees, the starving crew, provided data we couldn't get any other way. We learned that the Earth provides services that are infinitely more expensive to replicate than we imagined. We learned that soil microbes can consume all your oxygen and that concrete can scrub your atmosphere clean. These are lessons that will be essential if we ever actually try to build a colony on Mars or the Moon.
So, was Biosphere 2 a failure? If you judge it by its original goal of living in space, then yes, it failed spectacularly and dramatically. We proved that we are nowhere near ready to pack our bags and move to a glass dome on Mars. But if you judge it as a lesson in humility, it was perhaps the most successful experiment of the 20th century. It smashed our arrogant belief that we can simply engineer a replacement for the biological systems that keep us alive. It showed us that Biosphere 1, our Earth, is a complex, chaotic, and fragile machine that we barely understand. When you look at that glass pyramid in the desert today, don't see it as a monument to a failed dream. See it as a reminder of the incredible complexity of the air you are breathing right now. The fact that you can take a deep breath without a machine, that your food grows without hand pollination, is a miracle that we take for granted every single day. We tried to build a copy, and we failed, which means we really need to take care of the original. Because unlike the crew of Biosphere 2, if our oxygen runs out, there is no one outside to open the door. I'm curious to hear your take on this. Would you volunteer to be locked inside a sealed facility for 2 years, knowing everything that went wrong the first time? Let me know what you think in the comments below.